Alright, so now the rubber meets the road. We're going to take the patterns that we printed in Rhino and we're going to apply them to some stock. We're then going to saw those pieces out, fit them to each other, glue them to each other, tack them down to a piece of substrate, scribe around them, and then we're going to pocket the space where that inlay is going to live. Let's do it. Alright, so we're ready to break ground here. We've got our pattern printed out. It is not a bad idea to just pick a part in here that's easy to kind of quickly measure and measure it in real life and compare that to the distance command in Rhino for the same dimension, just to make sure your printer didn't print it at a 10% larger or 10% smaller or something funny like that. That can help you avoid some heartache. So we've got some backup pieces here. I'm going to need this piece to tell me where these numbers go once I'm just looking at a pile of parts here. I've decided these petals are going to come out of this piece of walnut, and I'm going to choose to orient the grain lines. Remember how we left all those in parallel? I'm going to put them in parallel with these grain lines here. So those will be these pieces, grain flowing from the center outward. And I'm going to have these little pieces come out of this piece of copper. So I feel like that's going to be a pretty cool match. Walnut on copper, and then as the substrate, I'm just using this piece of alder here. So, as we discussed in the previous video, got some backup pieces here just in case I should lose one or break one or miscut it. I'm just going to assume that it's going to work though. I need to just take some scissors or a razor blade, and I'm going to cut out this group. And I'm going to cut out this group. I'm just going to save these for later, and I'm going to keep that intact so that I can use it as a key for my numbers later. So I've got my patterns cut to sizes more appropriate for the size of my stock. I'm getting ready to kind of choose the final layout here. So I'm going to choose to put my grain orientation lines in parallel with the grain. That's kind of been the plan thus far. I should mention it is of critical importance that you sand metal. In fact, you want to sand anything that's shiny, so mother of pearl, reconstituted stone, plastic of any kind, any man-made material. If it's shiny, it needs to be sanded on both sides so that glue can stick to it. We don't want our pattern to come off halfway around cutting it, and we also want it to be able to stick into the floor of the pocket, so be sure to sand your metal. You can avoid some frustration that way. And it is my preference to give myself something of a hinge. So I held this up to the light to be sure that none of my parts were sort of falling off the edge of the stock. This is good to go here. I'm happy with where this is positioned. I could, of course, scoot it closer to the edge or cater the shape of this layout when I was still in Rhino to suit my material here if I really wanted to maximize yield, but I'm happy with where it is right now. Grain lines are in parallel with the grain. I'm just going to come in and give myself a little hinge here of tape. And it is my strong preference to not allow the tape to be on a cut line. The tape can cause some issues, and I don't want any of that cut line to get lost. So I'm ready to glue these patterns down. I'm going to use just standard Titebond 1. I think any wood glue would do. Even for the metal, that has proven to be totally sufficient. So these know right where they're going to go based on their hinge. Since I have so much extra stock here and I don't want to waste time spreading glue or covering this material with glue that's not necessary, I just gave myself a real light pencil line of this is where the glue needs to go, at least up to that line. So the procedure here is going to be squirt some glue onto here from the bottle, spread it relatively thin, but be sure that you cover every surface. And then I'm going to quickly, notice how I'm working on plastic here, I don't want to goober up the bench. I've got another piece of this plastic. So I'm going to spread glue under here, keeping the paper dry for as long as possible. I'm going to flip the paper down, cover it with the plastic, and then I can use my fingers. You can use something like a gift card to sort of squeegee the glue out. If you're doing really large stuff, probably a roller is the best thing. It's a pretty excellent thing for pushing the paper flat. And you're going to notice a ton of glue is going to squeeze out. In fact, I'm probably going to wind up using way too much glue. That's fine as long as I don't leave any significant amount of glue underneath the paper. If I leave any blobs, if I just kind of push it down willy-nilly, I will leave mounds of glue underneath, and they're wet, and they'll make the paper crinkle, and it'll be a big soft blob there that's going to be an issue. So use as much glue as you want. I'm going to probably opt to squeeze this one this way. I'm going to squeegee it this way to try to push wood glue off the edge rather than cover up this material here with excess glue. But it's critical for metal, wood, pearl, anything you're gluing a paper pattern to. A bare minimum of glue needs to remain after you're done kind of pushing all the glue. Think of it like an air bubble. You've got to get it all out, or it's going to make for a nasty spot in your paper. So those went pretty well. You'll notice that I use sort of a fresh area on the plastic. I'm going to go ahead and just let this glue dry on the plastic. It will peel off better once it's dry. The paper is going to be pretty delicate for the next 5 or 10 minutes. It will be extremely delicate for a long time if I allowed any blobs of glue to remain underneath it. I had a little bit of a sketchy situation I try to avoid. Some of the glue wound up kind of going up on top of the paper here. It's probably a little bit hard to see, but that area in particular, as soon as I saw that happen, I kind of like stopped squeegeeing and I very delicately peeled the plastic off just to be sure that nothing bad was going to happen here. Generally speaking, if glue gets on top of the paper, things are not going to go well, and particularly if glue gets on top of the paper and then you're spreading with your finger. That's kind of why we have the plastic here to resist any sort of roll this printed pattern right off the top. This isn't moving, but we're able to really kind of squeeze all the glue out. You may have noticed in the high speed that the glue on the walnut was extra heavy, so I just sort of squeegeed some of that off with my finger and just wiped it on a paper towel before throwing down the paper, and even still I got glue all the way out to here, so more than enough glue. I'd rather have too much than too little. This piece got thrown out of flat a little bit. I've come to find that they tend to relax after they've been dry for an hour or so. But in 10 minutes I would probably be okay to maybe cut out this periphery here, and then I'd be dealing on the whole with a smaller curve, a smaller potato chip. If I wanted to, I do need to be delicate of the paper, but if I got any significant amount of glue on the back, I might go and get that off while it's still soft. And yeah, we'll go ahead and let these dry, and then we'll get after sawing them out. So this has been hand plane smooth. That's going to give me even better cut lines on it. It's also going to save me a little bit of messing around when I go to level this inlay. If this surface is already pretty nice, it can be a pretty big bummer to put an inlay into a piece only to find that it's tremendously bowed this way and you have a lot of work to do. So maybe prep that work and sort of pre-finish this surface. So it's been hand planed. On this alder, that left a really nice surface. If you want to just finish sand it up until it's pretty smooth, that's also fine. I'm just going to take some shellac, a pretty light cut, and give this probably 2 or 3 coats. I'm going to be scraping it all off, so I'm not worried about putting too much, but the more I can turn this into a really sheer, flat, nice, clean, non-porous surface, the better my knife marks are going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and shellac this. Alright, so they've been drying for probably an hour. That should be ample. This is going to be a little bit annoying, but we'll deal with it. Here you can see why you do not want to allow the tape to go over the cut line. It always winds up taking a little bit of paper with it. So I'm loading up a 3/0 jeweler's saw blade. This little piece of copper is small enough that I'm not worried about it, but now would be a pretty good time to determine if this piece is going to give you trouble in the throat of your saw. This is a 5-inch saw, relatively small piece of stock, so I should be fine, but if there was any threat of my sawing being disrupted, I would go ahead and just cut this piece out, just so I don't have to do anything funny later. So I'm going to opt to cut out these walnut pieces first, not because they're wood, more because they're larger. So I'm going to cut them out first, and then I'm going to show you a little trick for sort of stopping halfway when we're cutting out the smaller pieces, the copper pieces, and getting some really nice fits going on before we're dealing with little tiny pieces trying to bend and fall all over the place. And as per usual, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to choose to go around these counterclockwise, thereby always keeping my desirable part, the part I don't want the blade to drift into, on the left side of the saw blade where my head is and I can see what's going on. I'm going to take some deep breaths, think about things that need to be occurring when I'm running the jeweler saw, always staying perpendicular to the workpiece, thereby making a square cut, so avoid any of this funny business. Also avoid leaning forward unless I'm making a long straight cut. I also want to try to avoid turning with my saw hand. I want all the turning to happen with my left hand. I want to be taking advantage of all those teeth, so I'll be taking full strokes all the way up and all the way down. And I'll be pushing forward very gently. I want to let the saw do the work. I don't want to be shoving the work into the piece. Another thing I need to be keeping in mind as I'm going, these lines here are not to be taken and they're not to be left, the cut lines themselves, so you do not want to follow directly down the center of that line, as tempting as it may be. You have to consider how these lines were drawn. So here we have part 5 and part 10 coming together. That's this part and this part. And you have to think that this line between them, the joint between part 5 and point 10, that's one line. It's copied to be sort of the right side of part number 5 and the left side of part number 10. So for these parts to come back together in the most accurate way possible, you need to be assembling, you need to be bringing together two halves of a line to make one whole line as it sits here. That's what's going to give us the best accuracy in this piece. So what that means is I need to aim to take half of this cut line here. I want to try to saw half of that off on the waist side at all times. So around the outside of these parts in this case. That can be a pretty tight fit. You may feel like that is approaching impossible to see what's going on with those lines. You can try printing it at different sizes to see what helps you out there, but the ultimate theoretically proper goal is to take half of the line here and half of the line there. When you bring those two halves together, you get one whole line and a perfect joint that is exactly the right size and plays nice with everything else. Alright, preliminary thoughts. I'm rushing a little bit, and I'm not pleased at how far away I got from the line here. That's going to cost me a little bit in filing. Should have tried to stay tighter to the line. However, I do feel confident that at no point did I take more than half the line, so this is the lesser of the evils there, but I'm going to pay for that a little bit in filing. Another thing I'd like to call your attention to, so I just cut out, this is part number 5. Rather than attempt to make this wicked tight turn up here at the tip, I would call this sort of an outside turn. Rather than attempt to make it on a dime, I don't really have to. All this material out here is waste. So I opted to actually saw past it, turn around up here in the waist, and then come back down the other way. So I didn't have to do anything tight here. That's always going to be my preference. And if for some reason I was cutting, let's say we had a sharp inside corner, so now this is the part we want, and this is the waist, I would probably opt to try to come in from this side, avoid that turnaround in there, just back the saw blade out, and then at some other point come and finish it off from this side, thereby avoiding rounding this area out. So onward and upward, I'm going to try to get closer to the lines there. I think I also felt like I wasn't taking full strokes, so made a note of that. Here we go. So you may have seen that I got a little bit greedy and jammed my blade, broke the blade and broke this piece out. Fortunately, the break went off into the waste. However, it did pick up this paper a little bit. I'm not sure if that came through in the video. So what I just did off camera was took a toothpick, put a little bit of glue underneath that sort of lifted section of paper, squeegeed it back down gently, being sure to not pick up glue and come and put that on top of the pattern. So I think that's going to be fine. It seems like it's stuck down well. We'll carry on. Another thing you may notice, and this is, if I have the option to do it, I will, there's no way I'm going to come in and start in a nice flat smooth area when I have the option to come in and start at a corner. So I'm going to choose to kind of start here, come up and work around this way, and then I'll go over here and I'll start at this corner. So you got to be kind of considerate about where you're going to start and where you're going to end and how that's going to be most advantageous to you. Alright, so we got the walnut cut out. Not my best work, but it went okay. I feel like I never really invaded the part severely, but I did drift to the outside a little bit. That's just one of those benefits of considering which direction you're going to cut it out and keeping your head on the keeper side. So everything is looking pretty good. Another thing that I sort of took advantage of, if you're keeping track of your design and what your plan is for the future, I know that I'm going to glue all these components into one piece, and then I'm going to tack it down onto the substrate and scribe around it with a knife. As such, I'll go ahead and scoot these aside. All of these lines don't have anything to mate up against yet. They'll be marked around with a knife, so you can... I tried to be extra careful here, and then I kind of went extra fast, and then I was extra careful there. So anywhere where it's joining another saw cut part, I tried to take a little bit more time, but out here, who cares, because I'm going to knife around it and Dremel up to that knife mark, so you can go a little faster there if you want. I'm going to take advantage of a cool trick here. It is not strictly necessary in this instance. These parts are small, but you know they would span the gap in the bird's mouth, so I could file them if I needed to. But this trick I'm about to demonstrate is essential as you get into tinier and tinier pieces, where you're looking at like 1/8 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch, and it's going to be nearly impossible to hold it, to file it, to adjust its shape. So what I'm going to opt to do, I've got part number 6 here. Check out my key. Part number 6 goes against part number 1. So rather than cut this piece out in its entirety, I'm going to make just this cut. And then, while I still have this big old piece of copper, I'll file this and this until they fit together just the way they are supposed to according to the key. I will then glue these two pieces together. Then I will make this exterior cut. Then I will make the same sort of half cut on 7. 7 goes to number 2, and I'll bring number 2 in here, and I'll sort of... in essence, I'm never having to manage this tiny little part. If it was very fragile, let's say for example I wanted this to be short grain running across here, if that was just important to my design, it would be nearly impossible to manage this piece without breaking it. So the only way to get around that would be to sort of make one cut, mate it to where it's gonna go, and then make the other cut, thereby never leaving you with a tiny fragile piece all alone. So I've not gone very far here, and I broke a blade. It occurs to me I was ignoring sort of a lousy feeling and just kind of continued working. I broke that blade, and copper does go a lot slower than wood, but still, that's not very much distance. Never removed this, so this was making everything feel a little bit wobbly and sticky, not inclined to turn, so this has got to go. And I'll just try to tear it right along the edge of the metal. If there's ever a burr or tape or a blob of glue or anything underneath this, it would be beneficial to come in and scrape or file that off. Just get that out of there so you have a nice smooth experience here. Onward and upward. So here we are with half of that little delicate part sawn off, and we're ready to start making this joint, which is represented right here. And I'm just going to bring those together and see where it's touching. Where I have a gap, I'll slide it around a little bit, taking care to observe what's going on my sort of key here, making it try to line up on both ends. I've got some definite daylight in the middle. I've also got a pretty heavy issue right there that's going to need to be filed away. But I might come in here and sort of rock these back and forth to see if I can't find a high point in the middle. Flipping them over is also a good bet if the paper is kind of blocking. You can get a pretty decent sense of what's going on there. It's not bad, but it's going to take some file work, and I will tell you, since this is a a pretty organic design, and I know I'm going to be knifing around the finished assembly after the fact anyways. I'm going to file the copper until I feel like it's smooth and fair, which is going to be really quickly. And I'm going to do all the rest of the fitting, getting this joint to be nice and tight. I'm going to do all that on the walnut, simply because it's going to file faster, and I'll get a nice joint sooner. And this design can tolerate it. Sometimes you won't have that luxury. It's important that you sort of stay true to what the pattern says, but ultimately, if this piece winds up a little bigger and that piece a little smaller, if it saves me some time, I don't think it'll negatively affect the look of the flower. So I'm going to go ahead and a little bit of filing here, the rest of the filing there, and I'll be checking them against each other pretty often until I feel like I've got a good thing going on. Alright, so that was probably 2 minutes of filing. I'm pretty happy with that. It's a little bit hard to tell because my wood is just 10 thousandths or so thicker than my metal, and that makes a little bit of a step. So I'm moving my head around, checking it out at different angles. Again, flipping it over. With the paper fuzz going on, it can be a little bit hard to see what's going on over here, but it is helpful to have that pattern handy. So now I'm going to go ahead and glue these two items together. And I want to do that from while I'm looking at this side. And I'm going to choose to do that over some of the non-stick plastic that I've been using. It's very important as we start building this assembly up and adding more and more pieces to it that everything stays flat and everything has one common plane that is the bottom. Everything is flush with everything else at the bottom so that it will sit down on the floor of the pocket properly. Any funny business with differing heights or tapered pieces or anything like that, I want all that nonsense to go up so that I can scrape it off and it will have a nice tight flat fit against the floor of the pocket all said and done. So on something flat, I'll take some of my non-stick plastic. Not a bad idea to have the pattern underneath it if you want a little bit of extra help to see how things are going to go. And so what I'm going to do here is hold these two pieces together, take some crazy glue with the brush, and brush glue across that seam. I'm going to do what I can to not let glue get on the next cut line that needs to happen, because I don't want to obscure it or tear it up or do anything bad to it. But I need these pieces to be pretty well bonded together so that once I cut the second cut, if you will, of this small piece, it's just one big piece now. And I never had to actually manage this tiny piece on its own. That's again, that's critical if you're trying to do small inlay work. You get into pieces that are like that big, and there's no holding that to file it. So you got to file sort of half of it while you still have it attached to the stock, join it to the next thing that it is going to eventually live with, and then you finish off that second side, and you can file it to fit the next part of the assembly. So here we are all glued up. I think it went pretty well. I did kind of a bozo move. This piece is a little bit curved. If you recall, that walnut got a little bit wonky and out of flat. So I held it real tightly on one end, tacked it with a drop of glue, let that set for a minute. And when I went to tack the other end, I tried to hold it flush with a razor blade, and I totally scraped up my pattern here. But I'm going to be able to survive that, and I'm pretty confident that I pushed this piece flat so that it shares a common backside, if you will. So nice and flat back here. A microscopic amount of glue squeezed through, and that can happen. In fact, it's a good thing that it happens, and that's why we're working with this plastic under here. So that's good to go. I'm going to go ahead and make the next saw cut. Probably it would be wise to give this just a few minutes to set up. I can see just a tiny amount of glue. I'll just show you. This is kind of the magic of the crazy glue bottle. So this is the brush, and this is a really nice way to be particular about where you're putting the glue. Soak it into the crack, but I didn't cross any of my cut lines or have any big nasty mess and gluing it down to stuff that it's not supposed to be glued to or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and make this cut. If there's a bunch of glue and you feel like it's not setting up and you want to get a move on, what you can do is wipe it away from anything that's... oh, yeah, this is already set up. I don't want to wipe it towards cut lines that have yet to be cut, but if I just want to push it over onto this paper just to make it set up and kind of get out of my way so I can avoid gluing my fingers down to it as I make this next cut. Okay, time to make this saw cut, and then as you might imagine, I'll go ahead and make the first of part number 7, which is going to be matched to part number 2. Alright, so I took that cut real intentionally. Did not want to jam my blade and risk breaking these two pieces apart. And another thing I sort of factored in is out here, the same rules apply that we were talking about earlier for this line. This is only going to be matching with the pocket, so I can kind of take some liberties here. Another thing that I'm thinking about, just because I have done this flower before, this is the center point of the flower. There's a lot of pieces coming together here, and the fitting of all 5 of these sort of pairs to describe the whole flower can be a little bit of a pain, so I sort of veered off my line and left myself a little bit of extra material here, just in case push comes to shove and I wish I had something that was reaching all the way to the center. Just not even a blade's width, but I just sort of wandered away from the line and left myself a little bit of an extra long point. I think I might appreciate that later. So there's no reason to file this right now. I'm going to go ahead and just carry on with cutting out this next one. I'm not going to bother gluing this to the next piece or anything like that. I would just as soon kind of get all these copper pieces mounted individually to wooden pieces. Another thing that's worth considering, I believe that there's a special place in hell for people who put glue onto jeweler's files, or any file for that matter. So filing on this while there may still be wet glue inside of it, this is a pretty tight fit, so I feel like the glue has probably set up. However, if you were sort of counting on the glue to fill up the voids, it will, but it will remain liquid. And if you put that into your file, it's very bad karma. So don't be filing wet glue. Carry on with the saw work here and get this thing wrapped up. Alright, so I just repeated that process 5 more times. Just did the exact same thing, made one cut on the copper, mated it to its corresponding piece, filed them until they were good, glued them together, always being sure to hold them flat with the paper up. I'm pretty happy with how everything is coming together. If you'll recall, I did make it a point to leave kind of all the center bits over long, so it does not go together real nice at this point, but it's not far off, and it's time, oh, that's not the right order. Yeah, I changed it when I flipped them over. It's time to start filing them to fit each other. Now that we've gone from 10 pieces to 5 pieces, it's time to start mating them to each other, and we have to be a little bit careful here. We have to kind of be looking at the big picture. It's pretty easy to forget about these 3 and come in and kind of pick the, you look for the high spot where it's touching and you file there. However, if you take the short road on all of them, you can have a pretty strong impact on this angle here, and the error kind of adds up, and when you get 4 of them nicely fitting together, the 5th one can be like out of control, super not gonna fit. So you have to, I like to do sort of a preliminary, I'll file 2 of them to be pretty close, and then I'll bring all of them back and make sure that I'm not doing anything funny where I'm encouraging this angle. It seems subtle, but a slight little bit of filing in the wrong area and making it turn the wrong way will compound and get pretty difficult to deal with. So yeah, I'm just going to go around and file all these to fit, and I don't want to do more than 60 seconds, maybe 2 minutes of filing, between any two pieces without bringing the whole thing back together and making sure I'm not doing anything interesting. This is one of those funny things about doing a design that has 10 pieces all meeting in the middle like that. You got to kind of be watching out for that. There's a lot of places for error to kind of compound and meet back on itself and give you some trouble. And I would like to get them all looking real nice before I glue any of them together. I'll stop with the gluing things together as they're fit. I would like to kind of pick and choose where and how I adjust things on the whole. So we got it all glued together. Just kind of got the fits decent, made my way around, made sure that nothing untoward was happening on the way the final piece was going to go in. I did wind up putting numbers on the underside. It's easier to see with the contrast back here what's going on. The lines up here are still helpful, so it's kind of a back and forth trying to figure out what the best plan of attack is. And now that it's all together, I put a pretty heavy coat of glue on top of it. If this were a more fragile shape with smaller glue joints in here, I wouldn't hesitate for a second to just glue some paper right down on top of this. Just paint the top, paint any fragile area, or if you glued something together and it broke and you're trying to put it back together, glue it, cover the top with glue, stick some paper down on top of it just to act as sort of a cast for any joint that you're worried about. And yeah. Next we're gonna tack this down onto the substrate, scribe around it with a knife, and we'll talk about pocketing. It's worth noting this is about 2 hours worth of work probably. From gluing down the paper, sawing everything out, filing it together, gluing it. Probably 2 hours worth of work. And I always find it interesting to note, even you've got these lines, you're taking things really slow. This probably doesn't come through on the camera real well, but if I had decided to glue this pattern to my substrate and then Dremel up to these lines, because I mean it's the same pattern, right? It always kind of amazes me how different things wind up after you file everything to fit and everything kind of shrinks and changes shape a little bit. Probably not coming through on the camera, but this would be this pattern cut exactly would be a terrible fit for what happened here. Just petals change direction, things get a little smaller, certain petals go further in and others get shoved out. So it's just one of those things, if you really want to... I'm predicting the top is going to look even a little bit better than that in terms of tight joints. But if you want that, you really have to assemble all your pieces together and then scribe around it, because things change, and when you're joining 10 parts together like that, they're not going to wind up being the same shape as the original.